It was August 12, 2007, when a motorcycle rider named Jerry Tobin was making his way through Warwickshire toward London. But a car pulled alongside him on the M40 and 2 shots were fired. 1 bullet hit him in the head and he was dead before his motorcycle reached the verge. Tobin had no personal enemies, but he was wearing a Hells Angels patch on his back, and that was enough to make him a target. This is the story of the Hells Angels and the Outlaws and the deadly feud that hit Britain. To understand how a man ended up dead on a motorway in Warwickshire in 2007, you have to go back to 1969 when the Hells Angels first arrived in Britain, and the chain of events that would eventually lead to that road began. It was 1969 when the Hells Angels arrived in Britain. The connection that made it possible came from an unlikely direction. George Harrison of the Beatles had invited members of the San Francisco chapter to stay at Apple Records in London in 1968. And the visit planted a seed. 2 London-based riders subsequently traveled to California, prospected for the San Francisco chapter, and earned their patches. On July 30th, 1969, 2 official charters were issued, one for South London and one for East London. The Hells Angels were now in Britain, and the British motorcycle world would never look quite the same again. By 1973, the South London and East London chapters had merged into a single London chapter. Over the following decades, the club expanded steadily across the country, absorbing the British motorcycle clubs it considered worthy of the name as official chapters and dealing with the ones it did not consider worthy in a very different way. The clubs that did not meet the Hells Angels standard were given a choice: drop your patch, disband, or patch over to the Angels and stop existing as an independent organization. It was not a negotiation. It was an ultimatum delivered by the most powerful motorcycle organization in the world to clubs that had built their identities over years and had no intention of surrendering them. For the motorcycle clubs of the West Midlands, that pressure had been building steadily through the late 1980s, and by the early 1990s it had reached a point where something had to break. The Wolverhampton Hells Angels chapter had been fighting a sustained war against the Birmingham-based cycle tramps that had escalated through the early part of the decade into something that could no longer be contained. Dozens of assaults across the Midlands, stabbings and shootings at biker events and on the streets that drew police responses and produced criminal charges and left men in hospital. The violence was not random. It was the Hells Angels enforcing the same ultimatum they had delivered everywhere else: get in line or get crushed. In April 1992, a man from Wolverhampton was charged with attempted murder after 3 Cycle Tramps members were shot and wounded when their car was fired on by a passing vehicle. The independent clubs of the West Midlands could see exactly what was happening, and they understood that the only way to survive it was to stop being separate. If the Hells Angels could pick them off one by one, the result was inevitable. But if they came together, they became something harder to dismantle. Prior to the 1992 Rock and Blues Custom Show, 7 clubs made that decision. The Cycle Tramps of Birmingham, the Road Tramps of Derbyshire, the Pagans of Warwickshire, the Pariahs of Leicestershire, the Slaves of Coventry, the Staffordshire Eagles, and the Road Runners. Several Welsh motorcycle clubs joined the coalition as well. Together they became the Midlands Outlaws, and the patch they designed was not accidental. A skull in side profile wearing a Native American chieftain headdress on a black and gold background. Each feather in the headdress carried a differently colored tip, paying direct tribute to the original patch colors of each of the founding clubs. 7 clubs, 7 feathers, 7 colors. The patch itself told the story of where they had come from and why they had unified. Every Hells Angels member in the Midlands would have read it immediately. The Hells Angels responded within weeks. At their annual Bulldog Bash Festival in Long Marston, 2 weeks after the Rock and Blues show, 2 Angels kidnapped, tortured, and interrogated an independent biker who was friendly with Midlands Outlaws members, forcing him to reveal information about the coalition's formation and their plans. The new organization had not even fully established itself, and the Hells Angels were already treating it as a threat serious enough to require intelligence gathering through violence. But the Midlands Outlaws did not dissolve under that pressure. They grew. In late 1993, they changed their bottom rocker from Midlands to England, as the Welsh clubs in the coalition had already claimed the Wales rocker. The organization was expanding beyond its original geography, and the patch needed to reflect that. Then, in 1994, they applied for and received a full charter from the American Outlaws Association, the Hells Angels, biggest and most significant international rival. At the patch-over ceremony, they retired the chieftain skull headdress and adopted the standard Outlaws patches with the iconic Charlie skull and crossed pistons. They were no longer a defensive regional coalition trying to protect their independence. They were Outlaws England, a fully chartered chapter of an international organization that had been fighting the Hells Angels on multiple continents for decades. In February 2000, the Outlaws completed their full patch over to American Outlaws Association membership. Around the same time, the Outcasts, a club based in London and East Anglia that had been fighting its own separate war against the Hells Angels throughout the late 1990s, disbanded and joined the Outlaws patch over. The Hells Angels now had a unified, internationally connected rival operating across Britain with the full backing of the most powerful anti-Hells Angels structure in the world. Both clubs ran major annual biker events in Britain, and the geography of those events created a territorial tension between them. The Rock and Blues Custom Show was started by the Derby chapter of what would become the Midlands Outlaws before they joined the coalition in 1992, and it grew into one of the largest biker gatherings in the Midlands. It sat in Outlaws territory. The Bulldog Bash was the Hells Angels' annual festival held at Long Marston Airfield in Warwickshire. It also sat in the Midlands. It also sat in territory the Outlaws had considered their own, since 7 clubs came together in 1992 and decided that handing over their patches was not something they were willing to do. For the Outlaws, the Bulldog Bash being held in their backyard was not a neutral cultural event. It was a statement. The most powerful motorcycle organization in the world held its flagship British festival every year on ground that the club formed specifically to resist it considered home territory. The Hells Angels had been doing it since the 1980s and had no reason to stop. The Outlaws had no intention of letting it go unanswered indefinitely. Running south from Long Marston through Warwickshire toward London was the M40. Every Hells Angel leaving the Bulldog Bash heading home rode that road. Every year. Through the same stretch of English countryside that the Outlaws had claimed as their territory since 1992. On August 12, 2001, a Canadian Hells Angels member was riding south on the M40 after leaving the Bulldog Bash when a dark-colored saloon car pulled alongside him and shots were fired. He was hit 3 times in the leg. He survived, but when police arrived, he refused to make any statement, and the investigation went nowhere. The case went unsolved. The date was logged, August 12th, the M40 southbound. A Hells Angels member shot from a passing car on a road in Outlaws territory. Exactly 6 years later, to the day, the same road produced a body. Jerry Tobin was 35 years old. He was Canadian by birth and had built a life in London where he worked as a Harley-Davidson service manager. He was a fully patched senior member of a London-based Hells Angels chapter, and by every account, he was a law-abiding man who happened to wear a patch. He had no history with the South Warwickshire Outlaws. He had no dispute with anyone waiting for him on the M40 that August afternoon. What he had was a Hells Angels patch on his back and a road to ride home on, and that was enough. On August 12, 2007, exactly 6 years to the day after the 2001 M40 shooting, Tobin attended the Bulldog Bash at Long Marston Airfield. When the festival ended, he joined the stream of bikers heading south. He stopped at a petrol station to fill up. Then he led 2 other riders onto the M40 and pointed his motorcycle toward London. He had no way of knowing that 7 men were already waiting across 3 separate positions along the route. The entire South Warwickshire chapter of the Outlaws had deployed themselves along the motorway corridor. Sean Crichton, Dane Garside, and Simon Turner waited in a lay-by on the A46. Carl Garside, Ian Cameron, and Dean Taylor were positioned further up the motorway. Malcolm Bull waited alone as support for both teams. The plan was straightforward. Wait for a Hells Angel leaving the Bulldog Bash and kill him. Any Hells Angel. It did not matter who. The car carrying Sean Crichton drew alongside Tobin on the M40. 2 shots were fired. One hit Tobin in the head. He fell from his motorcycle, which veered onto the verge. He died almost instantly. Jerry Tobin was 35 years old. He had never met the men who killed him. He died on a motorway in Warwickshire because of the patch on his back. The investigation that followed moved quickly because Crichton had made a fundamental error. He had used his own car. When police found the burnt-out Rover, it was traced back to him almost immediately, and he pleaded guilty to murder before the trial of the remaining 6 even began. When Warwickshire police raided the South Warwickshire chapter's meeting venue, Supreme Harley Supplies on Warwick Street in Earlston, Coventry, they recovered shotguns and ammunition from the premises. Mobile phone records presented at trial showed communication between the killers in the minutes following the shooting, which the prosecution argued were calls made to tell the other waiting teams the job was done and they could stand down. The case against the remaining 6 rested significantly on the testimony of Malcolm Bull, a 53-year-old road sweeper from Milton Keynes, who had been the chapter treasurer. Bull broke the code of silence and told police what he knew. Without his testimony, it is likely that only Crichton and the men most directly connected to the shooting would have been convicted. All 7 were found guilty. The combined sentences totaled 191 years in prison. Bull received a full life term. He had cooperated with police, and the court had dealt with his role in the murder, but the Outlaws do not recognize court decisions as the final word on betrayal. The club motto is, "God forgives, outlaws don't." Bull had broken the most fundamental rule in the 1%er world, and he would carry the consequences of that long after the sentencing was done. 5 months after the Tobin convictions, the conflict moved from a motorway in Warwickshire to the departure terminal of Birmingham International Airport. On January 20th, 2008, a group of Outlaws members were at Alicante Airport in Spain waiting to board a flight back to Birmingham. Hells Angels members at the same airport recognized them. During the flight, information was passed back to the UK, and by the time the plane landed at Birmingham International, a group of Hells Angels had gathered in the terminal to meet it. The Hells Angels understood one specific thing about the situation. Their rivals had just come through an international customs process and would be unarmed. Before the Outlaws cleared customs on the British side, the Angels equipped themselves with a machete, a meat cleaver, a knuckle duster, knives, and hammers. They pre-armed for a confrontation against opponents they knew would have nothing in their hands. Up to 30 bikers from both clubs were involved in what followed. Families who had been queuing at baggage carousels and waiting for taxis found themselves in the middle of a mass brawl involving bladed weapons and blunt instruments. Several bikers suffered serious injuries. One man came close to losing his life. 7 Hells Angels members were convicted of riot, and each sentenced to 6 years in prison. An 8th member, Mark Larner, fled to South Africa before sentencing, but later walked into a police station in the Bristol area and handed himself in. Both the Hells Angels and the Outlaws had by this point been officially designated as organized crime groups by West Midlands Police. Within the space of less than a year, the feud between the two clubs had produced a murder on a motorway, a mass-armed brawl in an airport terminal, and hundreds of years of combined prison sentences across 2 separate trials. The story of the Hells Angels and the Outlaws in Britain did not begin with Jerry Tobin and did not end with the airport brawl. It began in the late 1980s when independent motorcycle clubs across the West Midlands were told to hand over their patches or disappear. It accelerated in 1992 when those clubs decided that unifying was the only answer. It went international in 1994 when the Outlaws received their American charter. And it produced its most visible consequences on an August afternoon on the M40 in 2007 and in a Birmingham airport terminal 5 months later. The pattern West Midlands Police documented was straightforward. August 12, 2001, a Hells Angels member was shot 3 times in the leg on the M40, leaving the Bulldog Bash. No arrests, no cooperation from the victim. August 12, 2007, exactly 6 years later on the same road, a Hells Angels member was shot dead leaving the same festival. 7 men convicted and 191 years in prison. January 2008, 5 months after those convictions, a pre-armed brawl in a busy airport terminal put 1 man close to death and sent 7 more to prison. The Bulldog Bash continued to be held at Long Marston Airfield in Warwickshire every year. The Hells Angels never moved it. The Outlaws never stopped considering that ground their own. The M40 continued to run south from Long Marston through the same corridor where Tobin was killed. The Rock and Blues Custom Show continued to run in the Midlands as the Outlaws answered to the Bulldog Bash. The geography of the conflict did not change because the conflict did not end. The Outlaws formed in Britain to resist the Hells Angels. The Hells Angels responded with kidnapping and torture at their own festival in 1992. The Outlaws responded with a murder on a motorway in 2007. The Hells Angels responded with a pre-armed airport brawl 5 months after the convictions. At no point did either organization indicate the cycle was finished, because in the world both clubs inhabit it never is. 7 life sentences. 7 more convictions for the airport brawl. 1 conflict that shows no sign of ending. The Hells Angels and the Outlaws turned Britain into a battleground, and the consequences are still being felt on the same roads and at the same festivals decades later. If you want to see what happens when a man who killed for the Hells Angels decided to destroy them from the inside, click the next video to find out where it all started.